Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today I'll take you into the world of the Greek legends, to one of the oldest and most beautiful adventure stories of humankind, the homeward voyage of a hero across the wide sea, full of monsters, enchantresses, and wonders. The Odyssey, by Homer, composed probably around 700 years before Christ. We follow the cunning king Odysseus, who, after the long war for Troy, wishes for nothing more ardently than to return home to his wife and his son, and on whom the gods nonetheless lay a wandering that lasts 10 years. Make yourself comfortable, let go of the day, and come along. 10 long years the Greeks had fought around the city of Troy, and at last, through the famous ruse of the wooden horse, which none other than Odysseus had devised, the city had fallen. Now the heroes longed for home, and among them Odysseus, the king of the island of Ithaca, a man who stood out not through brute strength, but through cleverness, wit, and inventiveness. With his companions he boarded the ships, 12 in number, and put to sea, his heart full of longing for his faithful wife Penelope and his little son Telemachus, whom he had left behind as an infant. But the homeward voyage was not to be easy. The first stop led the fleet to the Cicons, a people on the Thracian coast. High-spirited and still filled with the spirit of war, the men fell upon the city, plundered it, and were ready to move on. But instead of setting off quickly, they lingered on the shore, ate and drank, and this carelessness became their undoing. The Cicons fetched reinforcements from the interior, returned in great numbers, and put the Greeks to flight. Many companions fell, and with heavy losses, Odysseus and the rest had to escape onto the sea. Scarcely had they recovered when a storm drove them far beyond the familiar ways, and for days the ships drifted over the waves until they came to a distant, unknown coast. This was the land of the Lotophagi, the lotus eaters. The inhabitants of this land were peaceful and hospitable, and they offered the strangers some of their food, the fruit of the lotus. But this fruit carried a strange enchantment within it. Whoever tasted of it was left by every memory of home and every wish for return, and he wanted only to stay and go on eating of the sweet fruit in dreamy forgetfulness. Some of Odysseus's men ate of it and no longer wished to leave, but sank into blissful indifference. Odysseus, however, recognized the danger. By force he dragged the dazed men back to the ships, bound them fast under the rowing benches, and at once commanded the departure, before the others too should succumb to the temptation. And so they escaped the land of the lotus eaters. But the most dangerous adventure still lay before them. After the voyage from the lotus eaters, the ships came to a lush green island, and from there to the land of the Cyclopes, a people of gigantic, one-eyed beings who lived without laws and without community, each for himself in a cave. Curious and in search of provisions, Odysseus went ashore with a small band of chosen men. They found a great cave filled with cheese, milk, and lambs, and settled themselves in it to wait for the dweller. But this was Polyphemus, a mighty Cyclops and a son of the sea god Poseidon. When in the evening he drove his herd home, he rolled a huge block of rock before the entrance of the cave, which no man could move, and discovered the strangers. Instead of receiving them hospitably, as was the custom, he seized 2 of the men and devoured them. Odysseus recognized that brute force would avail nothing here, for even if they had killed the giant in his sleep, they would have remained trapped behind the immovable rock. So he devised a ruse. He offered the Cyclops strong, unmixed wine that he had brought with him, and Polyphemus, who had never tasted such wine, drank greedily and asked the stranger's name. Odysseus answered that his name was Nobody. Drunk with the wine, the giant soon sank into deep sleep. Now Odysseus and his men went to work. They had sharpened a mighty stake and hardened it in the fire, and this they drove into the sleeping Cyclops' single eye and blinded him. Bellowing with pain, Polyphemus awoke and called the other Cyclopes of the island to his aid. But when these asked from outside who was doing him harm, he cried, "Nobody is doing me harm!" At that the others withdrew again, for they thought all was well, and so the ruse with the name had saved the companions. In the morning, the blind giant felt the back of every animal that left the cave to make sure that none of the men slipped out. But Odysseus had long since taken care and bound his men beneath the bellies of the great rams, where Polyphemus's hands did not search. And so they escaped and drove the herd to the ship. When Odysseus was already in safety, pride overcame him. He called out his true name to the Cyclops over the water, and this was to cost him dearly. For now Polyphemus could call upon his father Poseidon and beg him to take revenge on Odysseus. The sea god heard him, and from that hour on his wrath pursued the hero over all the seas, and made his homecoming so hard and long. After the flight from the island of the Cyclopes, Odysseus and his companions came to a floating island, the realm of Aeolus, whom the gods had appointed keeper of the winds. Aeolus received the travelers kindly, feasted them a whole month long, and wished to give them a precious gift at their parting. He caught all the stormy winds and bound them fast in a bag of oxhide, which he handed to Odysseus. Only the gentle west wind he left free, so that it might carry the ships straight to Ithaca. 9 days and nights they sailed, and already the homeland appeared in the distance, so near that they could make out the fires of the watchmen on the shore. But then, within sight of the goal, exhaustion overcame Odysseus, and he fell into deep sleep. His companions, however, plagued by curiosity and mistrust, believed that in the bag Odysseus was secretly hiding gold and silver that he did not wish to share with them. They opened the sack, and in the same instant all the storms broke out, rushed, howling over the sea, and drove the ships far back, away from home, until once more to the island of Aeolus. But he now turned them away in anger, for he recognized that the men must be pursued by misfortune and hateful to the gods, and a second time he would not help. And so they had to sail on, their errand unaccomplished. Next they came to the Laestrygonians, a people of man-eating giants. Unsuspecting, most of the ships steered into the sheltered harbor of this land. Only Odysseus cautiously moored his own outside at the cliffs. And that saved his life. For the Laestrygonians fell upon the newcomers, hurled huge boulders from the cliffs down onto the ships in the harbor, and shattered them. And the men who leaped into the water they speared like fish. In this horror, 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships were lost, together with their crews. Only the one ship that Odysseus had cautiously left outside escaped by a narrow margin, as the men rowed desperately out into the open sea. With only a single ship and a small band of survivors, Odysseus continued the voyage with a heavy heart, mourned the many lost companions, and drove on over the immeasurable sea toward an uncertain future. With the one remaining ship, Odysseus and his men reached the island of Aea, the realm of the sorceress Circe, a mighty goddess and daughter of the sun god. Exhausted and downcast, they went ashore, and Odysseus divided the men into 2 groups. The one he sent out under the leadership of a companion to explore the island. These men found in the midst of the forest the palace of Circe, surrounded by lions and wolves that were strangely tame, for they were enchanted humans. Circe received the men kindly, led them into her hall, and set before them a delicious drink. But into this drink she had mixed an enchantment, and scarcely had they drunk when she touched the men with her wand, and changed them into swine. Only one had suspiciously remained outside and had secretly watched everything, and this one hurried back in horror to the ship and reported to Odysseus what had happened. Odysseus set out at once alone to rescue his companions. On the way to the palace, the messenger god Hermes met him in the shape of a youth. He gave him an herb by the name of moly, a magic charm that would protect him against Circe's arts, and advised him how he should conduct himself. Thus armed, Odysseus entered the palace, took the drink, and drank it. Yet the enchantment did not work. When Circe now wished to touch him with the wand and transform him, Odysseus drew his sword, as Hermes had advised him, and threatened her. Startled, the sorceress recognized that here stood a man whom her power could not harm, and she yielded. She gave up her enchantment, changed the swine back into men, and from then on received Odysseus and his companions hospitably. A whole year they stayed with Circe, tended and well cared for, and recovered from the hardships they had endured. But with time the longing for home grew again. When Odysseus at last asked leave to sail on, Circe consented. Yet she revealed to him that he must first seek out a fearful place that no living man willingly entered. Before he could return home, he must go down into the underworld, into the realm of the dead, to question there the blind seer Tiresias, who alone could show him the way home. And so Odysseus and his companions set out from Circe's island and sailed, as she had bidden him, to the outermost edge of the world ocean, to the place where the entrance to the underworld lay, the realm of the dead. At this gloomy place, where eternal twilight reigned, Odysseus performed the rites that Circe had taught him and called forth the shades of the departed. From the depths they rose up, the souls of the dead, and Odysseus waited until the blind seer Tiresias appeared, for him alone he wished to question. Tiresias stepped before him and prophesied his future. He warned him of the dangers that still lay before him, and told him above all one thing. On his voyage, he would come to the island of the sun god Helios, and there sacred cattle grazed. If he and his men left these animals untouched, then they would return home, though after toils. But if they laid hands on the sacred cattle, then calamity would come upon them, and Odysseus would return alone and late after many sufferings. After Tiresias had spoken, Odysseus saw other shades as well. He met the soul of his own mother, who had died while he lingered far away, and deeply moved he wished to embrace her. Yet 3 times he grasped into emptiness, for a shade cannot be held. He saw the souls of famous heroes who had once fought with him before Troy and spoke with them. These encounters filled him with sorrow and with a deep awareness of the transience of all that lives. When he had heard and seen enough, he turned away and returned to his ship and his companions, richer in knowledge of his fate, yet also burdened by what he had learned. They sailed back to the island of Circe, who gave them last counsels for the dangers to come. She warned Odysseus of the temptations and monsters that lurked on his way, and described to him exactly how he must conduct himself in order to survive them. Thus, equipped with her counsel, Odysseus and his men put to sea once more, toward the next trials, which were now to follow close upon one another. The first danger they now met were the sirens. These beings sat on a blooming island and sang with beguilingly beautiful voices. Yet their song was deadly, for it lured the seafarers on until they were dashed to pieces on the cliffs. Circe had warned Odysseus, and so he stopped his companions' ears with soft wax so that they could not hear the song. But himself, because he wished to hear the song and yet survive, he had bound fast to the mast of the ship, with the command not to loose him under any circumstances, however much he might beg and plead. And so the men rowed, deaf to everything, past the island, while Odysseus heard the wonderful, alluring song and writhed desperately against his bonds to reach the sirens. But the companions only bound him the tighter until the danger was past, and so they survived the sirens. Soon afterward, they came to a narrow strait guarded by two monsters. On the one side dwelt Scylla, a dreadful being with 6 heads on long necks that shot out from a rocky cave and seized seafarers. On the other side lurked Charybdis, a mighty whirlpool that 3 times a day swallowed the water and spewed it out again and dragged whole ships into the depths. Between these two dangers Odysseus had to pass. Circe had advised him to keep nearer to Scylla, for it was better to lose 6 men to the monster than to go down with the whole ship in the whirlpool of Charybdis. With a heavy heart, Odysseus followed this counsel and concealed the full truth from his men so as not to cause a panic. As they passed through the strait, Scylla shot down and tore 6 of the best men from the ship, who vanished screaming into the cave. It was, as Odysseus said later, the most pitiful sight of his whole wandering. But the ship itself came through. Shaken by this loss, but alive, the survivors rowed on until they reached an island on which the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios grazed, those very cattle of which Tiresias had so urgently warned. When they saw the island of the sun god before them, Odysseus remembered the warning of Tiresias and wished to sail past it. But his companions, exhausted and still mourning the loss of the 6 men, pressed for a rest, and their spokesman insisted on staying at least 1 night ashore. Odysseus at last gave way, but had the men solemnly swear to leave the sacred cattle untouched. And as long as the provisions lasted, they kept their word. But then a contrary wind set in, which blew unceasingly for a month and allowed no departure. The food ran low, hunger grew, and the men had to keep themselves alive with difficulty by fishing and hunting. One day, when Odysseus had withdrawn to pray to the gods and had fallen asleep over it, the spokesman persuaded the starving companions to slaughter some of the sacred cattle. They did it, although they had sworn not to, and when Odysseus awoke and discovered the sacrilege, it was too late. The sun god Helios learned of the deed and demanded vengeance from Zeus, the highest of the gods, and Zeus promised it to him. When the wind at last subsided and the men put to sea again, Zeus let a terrible storm break loose as punishment. A lightning bolt shattered the ship, and all the companions perished in the waters. Every one of them, as Tiresias had foretold, because they had laid hands on the sacred animals. Only Odysseus himself, who was innocent of the sacrilege, survived. He clung to a piece of the shattered ship and drifted for days alone over the sea, helplessly given over to the waves. At last, the sea washed him on to a distant island, and this was the realm of the nymph Calypso. Calypso, a beautiful goddess, took the shipwrecked man in with her, and because she fell in love with him, she held him fast on her island for many years. She cared for him, and even offered him immortality and eternal youth if only he would stay with her. But Odysseus's heart longed for his homeland, for Penelope and Ithaca. And day after day he sat on the shore and gazed over the sea that separated him from all he loved. On Olympus, the seat of the gods, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, took up the cause of Odysseus and begged Zeus to grant him at last his homecoming. Zeus consented and sent the messenger god Hermes to Calypso with the command to let the hero go, and so the nymph released him with a heavy heart, and Odysseus built himself a raft and put to sea again. But Poseidon, his old adversary, caught sight of him and sent a last storm that shattered the raft. With difficulty, Odysseus saved himself by swimming to the coast of the island of the Phaeacians. There, the king's daughter Nausicaa found him on the shore, and her parents, the king and the queen, received the stranger hospitably. At their table, Odysseus at last told his whole story, all the adventures and sufferings of his long wandering. Moved by his fate, the Phaeacians gave him rich gifts and brought him with one of their ships at last home to Ithaca, to his beloved land, which he had not seen for 20 years. But at home the situation was dire. In all the years of his absence, insolent suitors had nested themselves in his house, who believed that Odysseus was dead. They courted his faithful wife Penelope, squandered his possessions, and pressed her to marry at last one of them. But Penelope stood firm against them, and fended them off with clever stratagems, for in her heart she still hoped for the return of her husband. Athena changed Odysseus into an old beggar, so that he could enter his house unrecognized and explore the situation. Only his old dog still knew him, and his faithful son Telemachus, to whom he made himself known, and together they forged a plan. Penelope had meanwhile proclaimed a contest. Whoever could string the mighty bow of Odysseus and shoot an arrow through 12 axes, him she would marry. None of the suitors was able even to string the bow. Then the old beggar stepped forward, took the bow, and strung it effortlessly, and the arrow flew surely through all 12 axes. In the same instant Odysseus made himself known, and together with Telemachus and 2 faithful servants, he held judgment over the suitors, who had so long defiled his house. Then, at last, he stepped before Penelope. But she, cautious after all the years, wished first to be sure, and put him to the test by speaking of their marriage bed. Odysseus named the secret that only the 2 of them knew, that he had once built the bed with his own hands around a living olive tree, firmly rooted in the ground. Then Penelope knew that it was truly her husband, and with tears of joy, the 2 lay at last in each other's arms again, after 20 years. And so Odysseus came home, and peace returned to Ithaca. That was our short retelling of The Odyssey by Homer, a story of courage and cunning, of longing and faithfulness, and of a man whom no danger and no temptation could turn from his way home. Good night, and if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow, here at Sleepy Classic Tales.